Welcome to today's session. We would like to welcome Dr. Jeannie Gunther. She teaches methods of literacy instruction for education majors at Francis Marion University and serves as the chair of the Early Childhood Education Program. She pursues research in the areas of professional development, technology, and literacy. Prior to university teaching, Dr. Gunther taught first and fourth grades in Durham, North Carolina, earning national board certification in the area of middle childhood generalist. She also owned and operated an extreme art and literature studio for toddlers in Durham, North Carolina. Today, her session is entitled Evidence-Based Practices to Teach Reading.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeannie Gunther. Thank you so much for joining today. Indeed, I am going to talk about evidence-based practices to teach reading. And while one of my specialty areas lies in early childhood, I am actually going to focus on reading practices for our older students. I'm going to look at and introduce you to some strategies that are really conducive to progressing our middle and high school level learners. I am originally from New York, moved to North Carolina in 1993 when I started teaching fourth grade. It's interesting to teach reading with different dialects sometimes. I actually think it's supportive of exploring words and sounds and things of that nature. But one thing I learned when I started teaching fourth grade is that reading would still need to be taught pretty explicitly. There's a general idea that in grades kindergarten through third grade, children are learning to read, and from third grade on up, they are reading to learn. What we find, though, is that many of our older readers still need very specific literacy instruction in order to be successful. In our upper grades, in middle school and in high school, we're seeing especially that our students need support specifically and especially in informational texts. Our students tend to do a little bit better with their comprehension when they are reading a novel or a short story, but sometimes with the informational text, it gets a little bit trickier, and a lot of that has to do with the size of the words that they're dealing with, multisyllabic words, also the very specific vocabulary needed to be successful in comprehending an informational text. So one thing I want to talk about today is considering the idea of small group instruction, even in middle and high school. Generally, we think of this format for our early childhood or elementary students, but it's a topic I would like to broach and think about in terms of our older students as well. As far as the strategies themselves, the list here shows the ones that we will be discussing today. The first is called What's Old, What's New. Next is Find It or Figure It Out. After that, we have Wordstorm, Tea Party, 10 Important Words, Preview, Predict, Confirm, Sketch to Stretch, Making Connections, Reader's Theater, Article of the Week, Quick Writes, and 6 Traits for Writing. I have included a few strategies that incorporate writing as reading and writing are reciprocal processes. The more a student reads, the stronger he or she will become as a writer. And the more a student writes, the more he or she understands a piece of writing because they are an author themselves. So I did want to add some writing as a way of supporting reading and vice versa. So let's talk first about format. As I said, typically we think about small group instruction being used only for our elementary aged students. I propose, though, that we embrace this idea for some of our older readers in order to more quickly progress them in the areas of reading and writing. A small group is very effective for pre-teaching or reinforcing what was taught large group. We can all think of students that we have in class that could benefit from getting sort of this leg up before a lesson even begins. So in other words, what if you had a group of students who did benefit from hearing information more than once or hearing it in a smaller setting? Pre-teaching is a good way to set those students up for success during a large group lesson. Also, you can see during a large group lesson who may have needed a little bit more help, or to hear something worded in a different way, or to have a different activity in order to be successful at the objective at hand. So a small group, when we think about our middle level students, our high school students, it's between 2 and 8. 8 would maybe be on the larger end of a small group. 3 to 5 is ideal. With fewer students coming to school face to face right now, I think this is a great time to embrace small group instruction. Some of our classes really are like a small group, and then we could even take them in half or work with students one at a time. By doing this, we reduce the student-teacher ratio. We don't have students who just sort of fly under the radar. They wait for somebody else to answer. We can really get a better idea of what each student knows and can do, and what confusions may exist for each student. It provides an opportunity to differentiate and progress students more quickly because the instruction is going to be matched right to the needs of that specific student. The other thing a small group can do is build a student-teacher relationship, which is very motivating for students. Our students do want relationships with their teachers, with other students. This is a safer environment for them to do that. They can take risks when it is only one-on-one or a few students at a time. And it really does motivate them as they can see more and more success for themselves by using this format. So in terms of forming groups, I think one of the more frequent questions I get asked is, how do I know who goes in what group? Data can be used. It could be assessments, it could be class assignments, ongoing observations, any kind of student response, whether it's written or verbal, and also student behaviors. That will help you decide. We can see those students in class that may have something to offer, but they feel reluctant to share it with the class. A small group setting will allow that student to share his or her ideas, ask his or her questions. And it also gives the teacher a chance to target the questions to find out exactly what the student knows or misunderstands, or how they could further that student immediately. So the groups might be based on a common academic need. Let's say there is a particular misunderstanding that 4 students have. That would be a natural group. What if there were 3 students who absolutely mastered what the objective was and they are ready for something a little bit more challenging? That's an obvious group. So one way this can be facilitated is to have your one small group and then what I call everyone else. So that just means the rest of the class. So you might be meeting with your small group while everyone else is doing something else, or you might have several small groups, and it's kind of the stations model. It's like centers, right? And we think of that in terms of elementary students mostly, but it has been found to be a very successful model even with our older students. The key with forming groups and with having small group instruction is that every single student should be included in a small group with the teacher on a regular basis. So if a student is performing at or above grade level, they're making okay grades, they seem happy enough in class, that doesn't mean that that student will not meet with the teacher. Every student can be progressed, and every student should always be progressing. And small groups is a way to do that. So here's just an example. Let's say you've selected a group of students that need help reading grade level informational texts. If you teach middle school or high school, you can probably imagine this scenario. So maybe you teach science and you can see that some of your students have a really hard time understanding the articles that you're presenting them with, or even the textbook chapters. Social studies, we work with a lot of trade books with social studies. Do you have students that are having a hard time comprehending the material, having a hard time reading it? The math textbook. And certainly language arts as well. And English has its own curriculum. I think many times the onus falls on the English teacher in middle school and high school to be the one who is now teaching reading. But truly looking at content area reading, it becomes something everybody chips in and takes ownership for, because English does indeed have its own curriculum. So how do these selected students usually navigate an assignment when they're given one? So let's just imagine this group of students. You can picture there are some that are just not comprehending the material, the informational text when it's assigned. How do they navigate it? Do they try it? Do they ask for help? How does that go? What are the scaffolds that have been tried, and what's worked and what's not worked? Have you tried supporting vocabulary first? I think a typical support that I've seen is the teacher doing a lot of reading aloud for the students. But eventually we want that responsibility to be released to the students so that they are doing reading on their own. And that does mean specifically supporting their reading instruction, even in these upper grades. So let's say you have this one small group and everybody else. What would that look like? If it's in a typical class during non-COVID times and you've got 20 students in the class or 25 students in the class, what is that going to look like? Well, the selected group would work with the teacher from 20 to 40 minutes, and it depends on the scheduling at your school. If you've got block scheduling, you generally have a very large amount of time. If not, you've generally got about 50 minutes. So certainly you're not going to give all 40 to a small group. If you've only got 50 minutes, you might be looking at 15 to 20 minutes then. But you would work 20 to 40 minutes on a specific skill or assignment. The teacher has determined that the selected group needs support, let's say, in building background knowledge, bolstering vocabulary, and overall comprehension. So can you imagine that? Let's say I've chosen 5 students that I see needing this, really thinking about background knowledge. How can I connect today's learning to what they already know? Bolstering vocabulary, that is a big one, regardless of grade level, and overall comprehension, which of course that more global skill of comprehension is going to be impacted if much vocabulary is lost, or if the prior learning was not connected to the current learning, then comprehension is going to suffer. So let's pretend you take this small group and they are going to use a strategy called preview, predict, confirm to support their comprehension of an article, let's say in social studies or science. And we are going to discuss this specific strategy in just a few minutes. But let's say you as the teacher decide you're going to take these 5 students aside. They are going to work on a particular strategy that will get at bolstering vocabulary, background knowledge, comprehension. So what about everybody else? That tends to be the biggest question. So how can I take 5 students aside? What will the rest of the class possibly be doing? Well, it's one of those things that has to really be set up for success for the whole class. Expectations for the students who are not in the small group must be set in advance. Otherwise, what's going to be going on? There will be a lot of talking. There will be a lot of wandering around, things of that nature. So rules for how to work individually or in quiet pairs and groups should be known and practiced. So the remaining members of the class, that actually tends to be a bigger concern than what will I do with my small group? The bigger concern tends to be, oh goodness, what will everybody else be doing? Well, the remaining members of the class can either read the article individually and complete a written response. if those remaining members are ones that can do that independently, if they're not ones that you're seeing having a difficulty in navigating that kind of material. Or everyone else might be working in small groups doing the same strategy that you're doing with your group, but they're operating it on their own. So they're still doing preview, predict, confirm on their own. And then the whole class comes together in the end to discuss. It's also possible that everyone else might be working on a project that's ongoing or another assignment of the teacher's choosing that's okay for the small group to skip that class day. So if the teacher is rotating who he or she is working with, which groups he or she is working with each day, then it would be okay to skip part of working on a project for one day, because the next day it would be a different group of students that would skip exactly that. Another example might be, let's say there's a small group that's identified to work through responding to informational text. So answering questions or writing a paragraph or a summary or an essay or something of that nature based on information read. The entire class, let's say, works on what I call find it questions on their own. Find it questions tend to be the easier ones to answer. Overwhelmingly, our middle and high school students do well answering those type of questions on their own. So a small group might receive help with what I call figure it out questions. And this is a strategy we are going to talk about today. But those figure it out questions, you can tell just by what it's named, are much more difficult to answer. And so guidance from the teacher would allow her or him to show the students how to think about and solve such questions, because our middle and high school students still need models for how to think about certain responses, how to enter a response, how to consider it, and then how to structure it. So we will be discussing this very simple strategy in this presentation. So in other words, in this example, all of the students in the class have read some piece of informational text, and they all, let's say, have questions to answer. This is a very typical scenario. In elementary, middle, or high school, you're going to read something, you're going to answer questions. It's actually our number one way of checking comprehension, right? We do this every single day in at least one class in school. So if we imagine that the entire class of, say, 25 students have all read an informational article, let's say, everyone will be answering questions, but the teacher is very specific about everyone's going to answer the find it questions. I'm working with these 5 folks. We're going to work on the figure it out questions. And so you're providing an extra scaffold to students who would need it on the harder questions. Then when they are not in group, they can do the find it questions on their own. And then certainly students who are working on their own, not in a small group, can go on to the figure it out questions if they don't need help with that. Otherwise, the other thing you can do is work with a small group and, in a train the trainer model, show them how to think about the figure it out questions, and then send them out into the class, one at each group, and they teach their peers. So you can see where a small group is really an efficient way of reaching the needs of everyone in your classroom. Okay, so thank you for listening to my thoughts on format for our middle and high schoolers. I think in these days when our students are fewer in the classroom, it might be a really great time to try those formats out. Okay, let's move along to some of our strategies that you might do in a small group. You might do whole group. You might do virtually. We will see. Okay, the first one is called What's Old, What's New? To perform this strategy, you would divide your students into small groups and assign each group a text chapter or a piece of text to review. A lot of times, If you're teaching a content area, the textbook is a very difficult piece of reading to navigate. And using strategies to help students enter that textbook is a very good way of being able to cover the material on grade level reading and really support their comprehension. So each small group would be asked to look over the topics, the headings that they find within their chapter. It's almost like they're each doing a little mini chapter review. Or it could even be one chapter that's divided into sections, and the class is going to overview that chapter and share it out with the class. Each group would make, I like to do it on chart paper, but each group would make a list of major topics of the chapter or the text and what it covers and list them on a chart under either what's old for content that's been covered in past classes. And it could have been past meetings of the class that they're in now, or a class that they have taken the year before or the year before that, or it was something they remembered from another class. That's fine. They're going to list it under what's old. This sounds familiar. And then what's new for material that is just completely unfamiliar. You will notice that due to varying past experiences, group members will disagree on whether their topics are old or new. Encourage them to reach a consensus. In addition, it's crucial that the teacher model this step before asking students to complete it. So the teacher could think aloud and talk about, this sounds familiar, but I still don't remember what it means. Should I put it under what's old or what's new? I feel like it's new to me again today, but it sounds familiar. And she would make a decision, or he would make a decision and place it somewhere so that it gives students a way of thinking about it. If it sounds familiar, I've heard that word, I'm going to put it under what's old because I feel like as soon as I read it, it's going to kick in. I'm going to say, oh yes, I remember this, and I can build on that knowledge. After that, ask each group to display their charts and lead their classmates on a chapter walk, pointing out the old and new concepts in each chapter. Encourage each group to seek feedback on their lists. So this is even a place where a gallery walk could be implemented. So if the students have sticky notes as they walk around, they can go around to each of those big chart papers and make a note. Oh yes, I remember this too from 7th grade, something of that nature, right? Okay, so our next strategy is called Find It or Figure It Out. And I discussed this in the introduction when I was talking about the small group format, that Find It or Figure It Out was used as an example of what the teacher could have been doing with the small group while the rest of the class was doing something else. So let's take a look at what Find It or Figure It Out looks like. Many students, and I mean elementary through high school, we are talking about probably 1st or 2nd grade all the way through 12th grade, expect to find answers right in the text. So when they get a piece of reading, they go through it, they read it, they get to the questions. Sometimes they get frustrated because they read a question and they go back into the text looking exactly for the answer to be spelled out in the text. However, that's not really how texts work most of the time. Much of what is to be learned from texts has to be pieced together. It has to be figured out. And it's sort of like, if you remember the QAR strategy, question, answer, response strategy from Taffy Raphael. It's been around a long time, and she outlines 4 different kinds of questions. And she's very clear about the fact that the reader brings something to the text, and it's what the reader brings and the author brings that is somewhere in the middle, somewhere combined, that's going to be our figure out type of question. So the Find It questions are, Johnny rode a red bike. It says that in the text. Then in the questions, what color was Johnny's bike? Those are the easy find question answers. Some things have to, though, be figured out, and those are a little bit trickier. And that is where some of our readers need support in how to even consider thinking about those questions and then answering them. So this strategy makes use of those questions found right in texts as well as those that must be figured out. The scaffold provided by this strategy is simply that the teacher labels the question types and provides text page numbers sometimes. Sometimes I do that and sometimes I don't, for where answers can be found or figured. And certainly it's a little bit trickier to put a page number on a figured response because sometimes it goes across several pages, or there's a little piece of it in the beginning of the reading, the middle of the reading, the end of the reading. And that has to be synthesized and then taken into account with what the reader brings to this piece of text in order to answer the question. So sometimes page numbers are helpful, sometimes they're not. And that's another way you can differentiate for your students. There may be some students that for find it questions, I might go ahead and put the page number to get them started. Other times for our middle and high school students, I don't always give the page number. All right, so here's an example. Okay, let's pretend students had something to read about tropical rainforests. And in this example, page numbers are given. Like I said, I don't always do that. But all that is required of the teacher for this strategy is that he or she takes questions already created, questions you're already doing with your students, and you just label them, figure it out or find out. And that can be done even after questions that you already have made up that you know you're going to ask your students this year. You don't have to write new questions. Just look at the questions and ask yourself, is this a find it one or a figure it out one? And just label it for them. It's something you could actually go through with the students when you hand out the questions and say, okay, we have 6 questions. Let's talk about whether they are going to be find it or figure it out questions. And the find it ones are necessarily more amenable to answering quickly, easily. So I will tell students, do all your find its first, because success breeds more success when it comes to school. And when a kid has 3 or 4 questions already done, well, that's great. I only have 2 or 3 questions left. They're my figure it out ones. They're going to take me a little longer, but I've gotten all these others done. So let's take a look at this example. Let's say students read about tropical rainforests. Well, the first question is figure out if there are any rainforests in Africa and Australia. So we already know by the fact that the question says figure out if, we already know that if we flip back in the text, there's going to be no sentence there that says there are rainforests in Africa and Australia, or there aren't rainforests in Africa and Australia. That there's going to have to be something that has students figuring it out. Perhaps other continents are named, and these are not when it talks about rainforests. Perhaps maps are provided as part of the text. The next question says, find out what high and low temperatures in tropical rainforests usually are and how much rain they get. Well, since it says find out, that means I can look right back in the text and find my answer. I can imagine that these are maybe listed out, maybe there's a table, but it's going to be something that the students can look right back in the text and find out. And that is something that they can do independently. The next one says, figure out how a forest is like a cake. You can well imagine sometimes when there's a question, students really want to find an answer exactly as it is phrased in the question. And there will be students looking for the text to say how a forest is like a cake. Well, it doesn't say it in the text. You have to bring your knowledge of cake. You have to bring your knowledge of forest from the reading and put those together. So perhaps there's something in this reading that talks about layers, right? Or talks about what goes into constituting a forest. So they really have to think like an analogy for this. So this is a higher level kind of question. And this is the kind of question that sometimes a student will get frustrated with because they can't just look back in the text and find the answer, that sort of thing. The next one, figure out which layer of the forest is as tall as many adults. Figure out which part of a rainforest is hard to walk through. So students really have to think about what's been said about each layer of the rainforest and what would necessarily make one of those layers difficult to navigate by walking. Okay, so these are the kinds of questions that our students are typically asked, except they don't always say find it or figure it out next to it. By simply labeling the type of question, students are already supported in getting started on answering their questions. They can all start with the find out ones. The teacher can pull students aside and show them how to work on the figure it out ones. And as I said earlier, if a teacher is working with a small group, let's say 5 students, and we talk about the figure it out questions, you can then send those students out to teach. One goes to each of the other small groups in the classroom and share very specifically how the teacher went through thinking about the figure it out ones. The next strategy is called WordStorm, and this is one of my favorites. Let's pretend, I got this piece of reading just off of ReadWorks as an example. Let's pretend there's an article for students to read, and it's on global warming, and it's just called, Is the Earth Getting Warmer? Now, this is about a page-and-a-half article. The vocabulary is a little bit difficult. It's very specific. If we just gave this article to students and said, here you go, read this, answer some questions, or read this, write a summary of it. In general, what will our responses be like? What kinds of things are we going to get in a written response to that? Well, it would be a great variety, wouldn't it? We'd get a great variety back. One way to support all of our students is to really tap into prior knowledge. If our students are reading this article on whether or not the earth is getting warmer, it's likely this has been discussed in class already. So we want to tap into some background knowledge. And to create a word storm, what I do is I go through the article or the text, the chapter, whatever it is that I want my students to read. And I go, especially if it's informational, this works very, very well with informational text. I go through and I think, okay, which vocabulary words are my students really, really going to have to know in order to walk away comprehending this article strongly? Well, what I do is I decide on those words and then I represent those words with one letter. So can you see in the middle of the screen, let's see, my cursor is right here. These letters right here are all representative of very important vocabulary words within the text that they're going to need to know. So what I say to students, before the reading, there are letters supplied below. Predict words or word storm that might appear in this section, that begin with the given letters, and then write a question that it might answer. So before the reading, I want kids to list right here, what are some words that have to do with global warming that would use these letters, right? So any of these letters. Well, I see an E there, I might put earth, okay? And then down here it says, write a question you think this chapter or this article or whatever piece of text you're using might answer. And I tell students they can't just restate what the chapter title was or the article was, right? So they have to think of something that the chapter might answer. Here's something a student might write. So before reading, well, I see a C up here. Maybe carbon dioxide has something to do with this global warming. Climate, if that's something we've been talking about. We've got a G, maybe gases or glacier. I've got an A, air, atmosphere, Amazon, things that the student has heard before. And so if we look at the question that this student wrote, Are people the only cause of global warming? So this is what the student thinks they might get to learn in this chapter or article, in this case, article. So here's just a piece of the article that I'm talking about, and let's take a second to look at it. I'll let you read that to yourself for a moment, and you don't have to read all of it, but it just gives you an idea of the level at which this article is written. And especially if you start looking here in this paragraph, a lot of the words that the students will need to know in order to come away with a good, strong comprehension of the article. And I'm sorry to go quickly, but I'm going to go to just showing a little bit more of this article. Climate change, disturbances, climate, phenomena, feedback loops, temperature, environment. Okay, so then the students go ahead and read the article. While they read, they check off words that they thought would be in there, and they were correct. They saw those words in there. What they then do, and students love to give themselves check marks, regardless of age. They really do like to do that. And then they're going to add words. So add words after reading. A lot of students actually do this during, and that's fine as well. It helps them engage with the text. So add words that appeared in the text that you had not anticipated. So all of these, okay? If you allow students to work in pairs, they're also discussing words. Right? They're discussing words as they get to them. Is it an important word? So the word, let's say, felt is in there, and that starts with an F, but is that something that's really crucial to understanding the article? No, so we didn't add it. Or the word and is in there. We have an A. Should we add the word and? No, it's not crucial to the article, to understanding the article. So they add these. Then write a question you know this chapter answers. Well, the student's question ended up to be totally different. How do feedback loops impact the climate? So really, really interesting stuff. And it gets students into the article rather than just reading it where their eyes are glancing over it in order to answer questions in the end. This really helps them discuss it and engage with the text. This is my favorite part of a word storm, though. I will, on purpose, leave out a letter that represents some pretty important vocabulary. Because after reading and discussing it, I might say, what's a letter you wish had been supplied that wasn't, and why? And students will say, well, you didn't put an H, and hunting had a really important piece in this article that should have been in there. Well, you should have had a T, because trees were mentioned so many times and they were an essential part of understanding global warming. Or W for warmth, wet, wax and wane. There were all these W words and I left out W. O for orbit. Okay, our next strategy is called Tea Party. And this strategy actually supports fluency, vocabulary, even phonics. If we think about decoding some really large words, like an advanced phonics, and then certainly comprehension. Let's say we have this article to read, and interestingly, if we look at the date on this article, June 21st, 2017, I actually used this article as an example in a professional development about a year and a half ago, and it was called Predicting the Next Pandemic. I got so many emails after COVID hit from teachers in that professional development saying, you know, this just reminds me of what we did with Tea Party. So, Predicting the Next Pandemic. Here's an article that's pretty thick as far as reading goes. And if we just had our students read it, like I said earlier, just give me a synopsis of what you read here. That might be difficult with so many specific vocabulary words. Many of them have to be decoded, thought about. Many of them are terms students have not heard before. So what I do is I tell the students, we are going to be reading a Wall Street Journal article called Predicting the Next Pandemic. And then what I do before class is I take this article and I break it up into little pieces and put those pieces into a PowerPoint. I print out the PowerPoint, cut out the squares, and make cards out of them. So this is a whole class instructional strategy. It helps oral language, vocabulary, fluency, comprehension. Make the cards like I discussed. You create the cards. You just take excerpts from the reading. I would just copy, cut, paste right into a PowerPoint, print it out. And usually I would do like 2 PowerPoint slides per page. So I would just cut the pages in half. Everybody gets a half sheet of paper with a piece of that article on it. And then they have time to practice the reading of just their card. So students take a few minutes, they read over their cards, they can ask the teacher, how do you pronounce this word? What does this word mean? If they're not sure, but they're basically just becoming experts on 2 or 3 sentences. For some students, I might give them more, maybe a paragraph, and I'll show you what these cards look like. Here's what one of the cards looked like. Analyzing a database of wildlife species and viruses known to infect mammals and people. They calculated how many unknown viruses may be out there, who carries them, and where they are likely to be. So looking at this card, there's not that much difficult vocabulary there, but a student would read that, be familiar with it. Here's another example. This is a much longer one. I can give this to a student who needs a little bit more of a challenge. Here's yet another one, a shorter one, and I would be strategic in which students got which cards, and I might need to rotate that responsibility around, where if I know I gave you a shorter one to read one time, I might give you a longer one next time. Here's another example of one of the cards. So all the students have a card, they each have a card, and they share their excerpts. They move around the room, stopping to read their excerpts to one another. Students should take turns reading and then discuss their interpretations, opinions, or comments on the 2 excerpts. They move around and read to another student. I like for them to have to read their own card 3 to 5 times. And what's happening then is they're getting new information each time as they're exchanging the reading of cards with another student. So they start to understand their own card better because they're getting other pieces of the story when they are hearing from their classmates. So then after about 10 to 15 minutes of students reading their cards to one another, they return to their desks and they can discuss what they've learned. What was on your card? And then what did you learn? What do you think this article is going to be like? Then I give them this article and they read it top to bottom. The comprehension of it is much better because they've essentially heard half of this article read to them already by their peers, and they've become an expert at a piece of it. So I really do love that tea party as a strategy. I can well imagine this being used in a Zoom class where students get to read their cards to one another. I do like them to read it more than once, but certainly they could take turns reading their pieces. Our next strategy is called 10 important words. And this is a fantastic strategy that can be used definitely more than once in a school year, used across the curriculum. It's designed to help students select the 10 most important words in a piece of text. In an informational text, students have largely selected the major concepts and ideas once they have located most of the important words. So let's say we have another Wall Street Journal article, and it is about noise pollution. Once again, we have a lot of difficult vocabulary words, and they have to be understood in order to understand the article as a whole. That noisy humans drown out sounds of nature and protected areas and how that's happening. So You have a 1 to 3 page piece of text selected. In this case, it's our article. It might be a printout or a section of a textbook, whatever. You arrange the students into small groups. 3 per group is ideal. You could do 4. I wouldn't do more than 4 in a small group for this strategy. Give each group 10 small sticky notes and instruct the students to read the texts together and place sticky notes on what they think are the 10 most important words as they're reading. As they're reading, what happens is they have to negotiate the 10 words because they might use all of their sticky notes and then get to yet another word. And they're like, oh, this is really important. Well, they're going to have to replace some choices with new ones as the reading progresses. Is there talking during this? Yes, and I would embrace it because the students are engaged in the text. When the reading time is almost up, tell students to make their final decisions and ask the students to write one word, one on each sticky note given. Make a class tally or chart of the words selected. Ask each group to tell one word selected and ask how many other groups included this word. Write that word and tally the number of groups selecting that word. Continue until all the words selected by the groups are accounted for. This sounds like it is going to be so many words, but honestly, when you're selecting the 10 most important words, after you survey the entire class, likely you don't have more than 15 different ones that have been chosen, but we're voting now on the 10 most important. So you're going to select a final top 10 words from the tally chart. So it might look like this. One group might say, we chose development. Okay, how many other groups chose development? And you make a tally. Once the top 10 words are selected for the class, divide the words among the groups. Groups might get 1 or 2 words. Each group must demonstrate the word's meaning by doing 2 of the following for their words. And they can choose these or you can assign them. They can list synonyms and antonyms. That is not one of the most effective ways to foster word meaning, but sometimes students like to investigate those things in online dictionaries. Define it from an online dictionary and put it in your own words. Draw a picture illustrating the word. They might act out the word. That is always very entertaining. Or return to the text to find a sentence containing the word and explain what that word means in this particular text, because words do flex their meanings. Okay, the next strategy is one of my all-time favorites, and I mentioned it when I was discussing small group instruction in the very beginning of this session. It's called preview, predict, confirm. And this strategy has been implemented a few different ways, and I'm going to show you a way that incorporates visuals and I think really speaks to students. This strategy makes use of visuals to build vocabulary and generate a schema for new texts to be read. Students work in a small group to consider 10 to 15 visuals that pertain to a text to be read. Students should take about 20 seconds to consider each visual, discuss it, and predict words they think would be associated with that visual. I would give the students about 8 minutes to write down as many words as they can think of that might occur within the text that they are about to read. And the teacher should direct students' attention to details in the picture and front load specific vocabulary that will be encountered. So the teacher is acting as the guide on the side, circulating the different groups that are working, and sort of insert into the conversation vocabulary that he or she knows the students are probably familiar with, but might need to hear from the teacher before seeing it in text. The teacher is strategically providing context and vocabulary, as well as helping the students record their ideas. So let's say the students are going to read an article and it's called Cultivating Turkey. Well, most of our students, if you say turkey, they are going to think Thanksgiving. And especially if we're going to talk about that article at this time of the year, they're going to think about Thanksgiving. So Turkey is also obviously a place. So the first visual I give them, I can either print these out or just have a PowerPoint on the board, and we can do it whole group or in small groups, but guiding the PowerPoint. I might show them this, and what are some words they might generate? They might say map, they might say ocean. I would give them another map. This is very different. Students are really fascinated by maps, and just having time sometimes to explore them, really think about them, provides a lot of insight. So they would discuss together, well, why is it different colors? You know, why does it look textured? What does that mean? Is this also Turkey? Does it look like the same shape as we saw in the first map? Here, I really wanted students to get at the word landforms. And so as they're looking at this picture and they're talking about mountains, they're talking about hills, they're saying valley maybe, I'm trying to get at the word landforms, and I might sort of plant that vocabulary word. I would show students this picture, and some students will get that it is wheat. The word that I really wanted them to get at was crop. And as I'm walking around the room and I'm supporting students as they write things down, I might say, well, what do we call it if you're going to grow enough of an item such as wheat and you want to sell it? What do we call it, right? So I'm planting some ideas in their minds as we're going through the visuals. And all of these words are going to be found in the article that they have to read on Turkey. I might show a picture like this because I saw that the word livestock was in the article, and I think, well, I'm not sure if my students have a complete understanding of what livestock actually is. And looking at this picture, I might say, well, we have animals here. What do they seem to be? And I get a variety of answers on this, that they are goats or sheep or something of that nature. And I'll say, yes, do you think that these are pets? That's an interesting question to ask students when trying to guide them toward a word like livestock, right? Clearly, these are not pets. Why? We see tags on their ears. Where else do you see tags? Things that are sale, things that are a commodity of some sort. So they start thinking about, okay, how does that go with wheat? How does that go with the word even cultivating? What does cultivating mean? Are we getting at that? This picture, most people will call this acorns. I actually have people who call this onions. Once you see it as onions, it's hard not to see it as onions, but these are hazelnuts. Again, we get at the idea of a crop and what can you do with a crop, right? You can sell it, you can trade it. Now let's think about our map. If you're in Turkey, with whom might you trade, right? Who's nearby? Here is another crop, and most students know this is cotton. This is an interesting picture because it actually, you see the Turkish flag there, but it's people commuting to work. And looking at a picture like this and trying to tap into background knowledge, students will say it's a boat, or people on vacation. Well, look at the people. Do they look like they're vacationing, right? They look kind of serious. They're going to work. And if we remember our map, there was a good deal of water surrounding Turkey. And so perhaps people take this type of boat called a ferry to work. Ferry is a very specific vocabulary word. So I do like students to know it before they go into this piece of reading. Here I'm getting at farming for selling food, for making a living, and even at climate. I will bring students' attention to what the woman in the picture is wearing, right? Does she look comfortable? She doesn't look too cold. She doesn't look too warm. She does have on long sleeves. So what can you get an idea of climate-wise, temperature-wise? Here, I wanted students to get at the idea of ruins. Most students will call this a castle. Some might say fortress, but we get at the idea of ruins, and why might this become ruins? What does that even mean? And here the word I wanted to get at was cliff. It's a very specific word, but I think sometimes a cliff is easier to explain with a photo than with words. Okay, so students then read together as a small group, placing a check by the words they predicted that were indeed in the text. Then they add up to 5 words they wish they would have predicted. They'll get to a word and go, I should have put that. As an extension, students can individually write a paragraph or two summarizing what they've learned, using as many of the words on the list as possible, including the 5 they added. That list acts as a piece of pre-writing, really. It gives them a basis for knowing what they could put into their writing. Many times our students stall in their writing because they're not sure where to start. They don't have a place to start. This acts as a very nice springboard and supports students as they put together a summary. So here's just an excerpt from Cultivating Turkey. This is written on a high school level, but you can see words like climatologists, terrain, things like that. Those are words that I would get at through the visuals and by walking around and supporting students. Our next strategy is called sketch to stretch. Many variations on this strategy. It's actually quite a simple one, and it uses the idea of visualizing the passage and interpreting it by creating a sketch. Many students will say they don't like art, they're not artistic. It's okay. With a sketch, it can be very, very simple. It can be stick figure people, but it's typically followed by a class discussion. It's a good way for a teacher and the students to engage during a read aloud. A teacher might read part of a text aloud and say, create a sketch that captures what I just read. Or even more specifically, create a sketch that captures what just happened in the kitchen. Something like that. It's also a good way of note taking. Lots of times we want students to take notes during a reading. What they tend to do is copy directly from the text as their notes, and then they have sometimes a hard time knowing what it meant pulled out of context. So by asking a student to make a sketch, it actually has them really interpreting, really thinking about a text. Text connections, I'm going to go through this one quickly because I do think most teachers are familiar with this. Typically language arts teachers are familiar with this. I don't know how often this has been used across the curriculum in content area, reading and writing, but connecting to text builds on prior knowledge. It allows for a deeper engagement with text, and it really builds comprehension. Our 3 ways to connect to a text is text to self, which is the easiest way for our students to connect to text, whether they are in kindergarten or 12th grade. Text to self is the easiest connection to teach, and it is the one that I would teach first so that they understand what I'm trying to do with text to text and text to world. But text to self, text to text, and text to world are the 3 main ways of making these connections. So I gave you a link here that pretty much just gets to what I've chopped up and put into this PowerPoint, but text to self is asking students, and this is just some sentence starters you can give them to have them connecting to text. How do the ideas in this text relate to your own life, your ideas, your experiences? Oh, what I just read reminds me of a time when I understand what I just read because in my own life, or I don't agree with what I just read because in my own life, right? So they are reading a piece, stopping and considering it. Does this remind you of anything you've ever done? It doesn't have to be an exact mapping onto of your life, but something that connects. Oh yeah, that happened to me once, or it reminds me of. Text to text. So when this strategy was originally conceived, it was mostly trying to get at written text to written text. However, text is more widely conceived of within this strategy. So lots of times you will read with students and they'll say, oh, this reminds me of a movie I saw. Or, oh, this is just like a song, right? So they can connect to it in some other way, that a text to another form of media, that's fine. We still want them building connections. What I just read reminds me of a movie I saw, a television show I saw. The ideas in this text are similar to the ideas in blank because. And then text to world, this is actually the hardest one for students of any age, because in order for them to connect the text to the larger world, they need knowledge of the world, which is why I like to do readings across the curriculum, bringing in events, things of that nature, because it does give them another way to connect. What I just read makes me think about blank. I like to use the book The Lorax as an example of a book that holds a lot of text to world connections. So it's this children's book. However, it's about taking care of the earth. It's about recycling. It's about greed, right? So some of these ideas that cross human condition can get at text to world. So it doesn't even always have to be necessarily an event, but something like motherly love or hope. These things get at text to world connections, big understandings. Our next strategy is called Reader's Theater. And Reader's Theater is a dramatic reading of a piece of text. It is not a play. The readers do not memorize the text, but they do hold repeated readings of the same piece of text. They do read the same thing several times. And by doing that, they build fluency and they build comprehension. The other thing you can do with Reader's Theater, I think a lot of people are familiar with this strategy of Reader's Theater, but of incorporating Writer's Theater, where we are actually changing the scripts a little bit. So use a familiar text written in script form. This is not actually the text that they will perform their dramatic reading of. They do choose parts, they read through the script together, just like you think of with a traditional reader's theater. But then what they do is they work together to replace words, phrases, add a little bit to their lines. This is great for those reluctant writers who can't start with a blank piece of paper, that it's just so intimidating to have this completely blank piece of paper. If they've got a script in front of them and all they're doing is editing it, they might make it more contemporary with their words, or they might make it more meaningful, or they might use a thesaurus and use some juicier words. Then they perform their script. I like to have them make what I call an identity headband, usually just out of a sentence strip or a piece of paper that just says the name of their character, so that those watching can follow along. Sometimes a simple prop. But let's take a look at a scoring rubric for something like this. I love this fluency rubric because fluency truly does support comprehension. And lots of times, especially our older readers, they read things just once and that's it. As their reading becomes more technical in the upper grades, it makes sense that they might need time to read it more than once. And if we think about fluency, many times we just think about speed, like how fast somebody can read. But truly, fluency is about more than that. It's about expression and volume, phrasing, smoothness, and pace. I don't worry so much about expression for a read aloud from an older reader if that's just not their personality. But if the comprehension is still good, then okay. But as a student reads something more than once, you will see the expression really does come out, because now there's an interpretation of the passage. This rubric is written by Timothy Rosinski, and it's available widely online in a variety of places. But what I love about it is that just one of these domains might be taught, or just two, or you might score each student overall using the whole rubric after giving them a chance to read something 4 or 5 times as practice first. Article of the week. I absolutely adore article of the week as a strategy for our upper level students for a variety of reasons. So as I was talking about knowledge of the world being so important in a reader connecting to text, especially making a text to world connection, they do need knowledge of the world. And this strategy is designed by Kelly Gallagher. And I've given you a link right here to his article of the week archive. And there are tons and tons of articles there to share one a week with your class. And it's building knowledge of the world, which is then building readers and writers and thinkers. Dave Stewart Jr. also does article of the week. He actually links many of Dr. Gallagher's articles, but both places are good sources. Dave Stewart actually has his sectioned off as timeless articles and time-sensitive articles, so that if you're teaching, let's say, a current events class, go to those time-sensitive articles. They're all right there. And sometimes they're grouped where you might have 3 weeks in a row on the same topic, but different articles. I love that. There's also, okay, so each article of the week begins with this right here, this box up here. It will say, mark your confusion, show evidence of close reading. So when I'm looking for evidence of close reading, I'm looking for certain key facts that are underlined. I'm looking for notes in the margin. And then it says, write a 1+ page reflection. I might actually make that shorter when I first start this. And to just leave it open to reflection might be a little bit difficult. We'll talk about how that can be scaffolded in just a minute. So this article says more than 90 million people have already voted. Here's how that compares with past elections. And look at the date on this. This is a very relevant article right now. So students would be interested in reading this. Here's one way, and this is from Dave Stewart Jr.'s webpage that I gave you a link to. Here's one way that he scaffolds the reflection. And it's done kind of as a close activity with fill in the blank. The general argument made by X in his or her work, the title of it goes here, is that blank. So students have to really think about what's the general argument being made. More specifically, they argue blank. Now I'm looking for a detail. He or she writes, now I'm looking for a quote that supports that detail, right? So it really scaffolds how the student is thinking about the article. And I might have my students use this template week after week, because as you vary the articles, they're having to think about different content, but the structure of how to respond becomes the same. What I love about this too, our students have to do those TDAs, those text-dependent analyses, right? This gets them really in that mind frame. So I absolutely adore this structure for our students. Quick writes is our next strategy. And this is one of those strategies where the name pretty much delineates what is about to happen as the strategy. So it's an impromptu response before, during, or after a reading. Obviously, spelling and structure do not matter in these responses. It's just to get content of thought down on paper. That's all it is. So an example might be, why do you think Bridget left the cave? So if the teacher is doing a read aloud, or let's say the class is reading something together, everyone stop here, write it down. What do you think Frank will do next? Right? And so students write their responses in a few minutes. You can discuss them at the end of the reading. It's such a fabulous way to have students quickly and easily engaging with texts. If you are somebody that likes to have journals with your students, when I did journals with my older students, I want to say every third page in their journal was a quick write, because it's just getting those ideas down. I'd really like to talk about writing in general. How do we score and teach writing? I think that it is such an intimidating aspect, and we can think about the reactions that our students have when we say, okay, well, today we're going to write. You get a lot of, oh, right? Students don't want to write. Many times it's because they're unsure of the expectation, or maybe they haven't had much success with writing in the past or getting feedback that made them feel like they were a good writer. What I love about six traits, and you may have heard six traits before, six traits have been around since the 80s, and it was developed by teachers. It's been changed over the years. It's actually kind of difficult to chart its growth over the years. It's researched currently. It's been researched in the past for its effectiveness. But what it does is it gives a structure for considering one trait at a time in writing in order to promote growth in just that trait. Certainly, if a student works on one particular piece of writing with many rounds of editing, things of that nature, they could be graded on all six traits. It allows for promotion of growth in differing areas in order to individualize for students' needs. So you might have a student who's really strong in one trait. Well, they don't need further instruction them, further them in another trait. So here's a high school writing example. Let's say a student wrote this essay. I'll give you a moment to read it. Okay, so pretty good essay. Sometimes what's hard as a teacher is, well, how do I score it? I loved it. It was a total story. What do I do? How do I assign a grade to this? How do I help the student go further in his or her writing? How do I support this student? Well, let's look at the six traits that might possibly go into a piece of writing. The first is ideas. Second is organization. Third is voice. Fourth is word choice. Fifth is sentence fluency, conventions. And then some people say the six traits plus one. That plus one is presentation. So we still have our essay over here. And if we're just going to consider the ideas, the content, so what is the meat of this story? That's the ideas, right? We do have students who sometimes have a hard time getting started with their piece of writing because they're not sure what to write about, right? And sometimes they actually do better with a prompt because they have to make their ideas fit something specific. But let's just take a look at what would get a student a 6 on this particular rubric. Especially clear, focused, interesting. Do the main ideas stand out? Is there strong support, rich details? Is it balanced? Does it show insights? I think even in a short essay, this is a pretty strong one for ideas. And I'm not sure if I would give it a 6 or a 5, or, I'd have to really consider each of these. But I do see some rich ideas in what this student is writing about. So a rubric like this would help me consider this student just for the area, just for the trait of ideas. Let's look at the next one, organization. Organization is tricky. We do have some students that write in a way that's called messy text, which is actually its own organization and can be brilliant. Other students always write in the same exact organization, that it's always chronological with a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? So here's my same essay, and I might consider it just for organization, right? And I would think about it. Is it sequencing that I can follow? Is it a satisfying conclusion? And many times we'll find a piece of writing is somewhere in between two areas of the rubric, and that's fine. For me, I would generally go toward the lower score, but then help the student make it a very solid next domain up for the next time they did a piece of writing. Let's consider this same
piece of writing for conventions. This tends to be where our students actually get a lot of instruction, is on spelling, grammar, things of that nature. I actually like to do that part very last in the editing process, because I want students to get their ideas, their content, their organization all in place. And to me, conventions can help us in the editing stage later rather than earlier, because once a student edits for conventions, they are not very willing to make big changes in their organization or their ideas, because they already have the convention part figured out. They don't really want to make some other types of changes. Voice is my very, very favorite part of any piece of writing. It's the heart and soul of what the student is writing. Does it sound like them? Is it connecting to the audience in some way? And this rubric right here would help you get at this same exact essay, looking at it just for voice. Do we get an idea of who this person is? Do they connect with their audience? Sentence fluency. This is actually an area where many of our students need support. Our students tend to write sentences that start the same, end the same. They're metered, they're about the same length. An interesting piece varies the length of sentences, varies the sentence structure. And this could be a lesson in and of itself, is just look at your first 3 sentences. Do they look all the same? Do we need to change one? How else could we say it? How could we make that sentence longer? How could we make that sentence shorter? Word choice. Words are my favorite art medium. Choosing just the right word can really pack a powerful punch in a piece of writing. How are the word choice? Are they specific words chosen that really give us a feel for this piece of writing? Do they really underscore what's being said here? Let's look at this example. The person behind me, a muscular blonde guy, made polite conversation, right? He's very specific in it, but he's still not necessarily using words that would then sound too forced, right? This is a comfortable kind of essay. He's just telling a little personal story. So we think about how the word choice goes for this specific piece. These are the references to the strategies discussed in this presentation. There are also a few links within the presentation that you might find helpful for rubrics and things of that nature. I hope these strategies were helpful for you. If you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear from you. I am Jeannie Gunther, and my email is jgunther@fmarion.edu. Thank you so much.